I stood in the back corner of St. Margaret's Chapel, watching my own family treat me like a ghost at my mother's funeral. While my half-siblings Linda and Marcus mingled with guests in their expensive black suits, shaking hands and accepting condolences like they were the only children she'd ever had, I remained invisible in my thrift store dress, clutching a wilted carnation I'd picked from the church garden because I couldn't afford the elaborate floral arrangements they'd ordered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Nobody acknowledged me. Not when I walked in 20 minutes, late because my old Honda had broken down on the highway. Not when I slipped into the last pew, trying not to let my worn shoes squeak against the marble floor. Not even when I quietly sobbed during the eulogy that Linda delivered, painting a picture of our mother that completely erased my 38 years of existence. According to Linda's carefully rehearsed speech, Mother had been blessed with 2 successful children who had made her proud, a beautiful home in the hills, and a life of comfort and grace. There was no mention of her third daughter, the one who had dropped out of nursing school to care for her during the final 6 months of her life. The whispers started during the reception at the country club. I hadn't planned to attend, knowing I couldn't afford the membership fees that would make me welcome in that marble and mahogany world, but something inside me refused to let them celebrate Mother's life without acknowledging mine. I drove my dented Honda past the valet station, parking it myself between 2 gleaming Mercedes, and walked through the front doors wearing the only black dress I owned. Linda spotted me first, her perfectly contoured face twisting into an expression of barely concealed disgust. She was surrounded by a circle of Mother's Bridge Club friends, women who had known me since I was a child, but now looked through me like I was a piece of furniture someone had forgotten to remove. I heard Linda's voice carry across the room as she gestured in my direction with her champagne glass. "I honestly don't know why she's here," Linda said, loud enough for half the room to hear. Mother tried to help her for years, but some people just refused to take responsibility for their own lives. It's actually embarrassing. Marcus joined the conversation from across the room, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. At 42, he was the golden child, the successful attorney who had followed in our late father's footsteps and built a practice that Mother bragged about to anyone who would listen. He looked at me standing alone by the appetizer table and shook his head with theatrical sadness. "The sad truth is that Rose has been a disappointment since high school," he announced to his audience of colleagues and family friends. While Linda and I were building careers and families, Rose was jumping from one failed relationship to another, one dead-end job to the next. Mother spent a fortune trying to get her on her feet, and this is what we get in return. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I didn't move. I had learned long ago that defending myself only gave them more ammunition, more reasons to paint me as the unstable sister who couldn't handle criticism. Instead, I stood there, letting their words wash over me like cold rain, focusing on the truth they would never acknowledge. While Linda had been climbing the corporate ladder at her marketing firm, and Marcus had been building his legal empire, I had been the one sitting beside Mother's hospital bed during her chemotherapy sessions. I had been the one who moved back into her house when the cancer returned, sleeping on the couch for 6 months so I could help her with medications, doctor appointments, and the 1,000 small indignities that come with dying slowly. The truth was that Mother and I had grown closer during those final months than we had ever been when I was growing up. While Linda and Marcus sent flowers and made brief, awkward visits that always seemed to revolve around their own schedules and achievements, I had been there for the quiet moments. The late-night conversations when Mother couldn't sleep because of the pain. The mornings when she was too weak to shower alone. The afternoons when she wanted to go through old photo albums and tell me stories about her childhood that she had never shared with anyone, but none of that mattered to Linda and Marcus. All they saw was their irresponsible little sister who had never managed to achieve their level of conventional success. They saw the woman who had dropped out of college, who had never married, who worked as a part-time home health aide and lived in a rented studio apartment above a dry cleaner. They didn't see the woman who had sacrificed her own plans to care for the person who had given them life. Mrs. Henderson, one of Mother's DT's oldest friends, approached me cautiously while Linda and Marcus continued their performance for their respective audiences. She was a tiny woman in her 70s with kind eyes and silver hair that she wore in the same style she had maintained for 30 years. She had known our family since before I was born, and unlike the others, she looked at me with something that resembled warmth. "Rose, dear," she said quietly, touching my arm with a gentleness that almost brought me to tears. "I want you to know that your mother talked about you constantly during those last months. She was so grateful for everything you did." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Mrs. Henderson glanced around the room, making sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "Don't let them make you feel small," she whispered. "Your mother saw what you sacrificed, and she appreciated it more than you know. Some things matter more than money and status, and your mother understood that at the end." Before I could respond, Linda's voice cut through the ambient conversation like a knife. She had moved closer to where I stood, and her tone had shifted from dismissive to openly hostile. "I hope you're not planning to make a scene," she said, loud enough for Mrs. Henderson to hear every word. "This is supposed to be a celebration of Mother's life, not another opportunity for you to play the victim." Marcus appeared beside his sister, forming a united front that had been perfected over decades of family gatherings, where I was treated like an unwelcome guest, rather than an equal participant. He looked down at me with the same expression he probably used on opposing counsel in court, a mixture of pity and calculated intimidation. "We know you're probably struggling financially," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone offering charity to a beggar. "If you need help with rent or groceries, we can discuss something reasonable. But we want to be clear that Mother's estate will be handled appropriately through proper legal channels, with people who understand financial responsibility." The implication was obvious. They were already dividing Mother's assets between themselves, and they wanted to make sure I understood that I wouldn't be included in those discussions. They were offering me scraps from their table while they carved up the main course, and they expected me to be grateful for their generosity. I looked around the room at the faces of people who had known me my entire life. People who had watched me grow up in the same house as Linda and Marcus, attend the same schools, participate in the same family traditions. Now they looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into their exclusive gathering by mistake. The women who had once complimented Mother on her beautiful daughters now whispered behind their hands about the unfortunate third child who had never lived up to her potential. The men who had bounced me on their knees when I was small now avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama playing out in front of them. But what hurt most was the realization that Linda and Marcus genuinely believed their own narrative. They weren't consciously lying about my relationship with Mother or my contributions to the family. In their minds, financial success and social status were the only meaningful measures of worth, and by those standards, I had indeed failed. They couldn't see past their own definitions of achievement to recognize that love, sacrifice, and presence might have their own value. Linda continued, her monologue, her voice growing more confident as she sensed the room's attention. "The truth is that Mother enabled Rose for too long. She gave her money, paid her bills, made excuses for her choices. We tried to warn her that she was only making things worse, but Mother had a soft heart. She couldn't accept that some people just aren't capable of taking care of themselves." I felt something inside me snap, not into anger, but into a strange kind of clarity. For the first time since I had walked into the chapel, I spoke. "You're right," I said, my voice carrying farther than I had intended. Mother did have a soft heart. She also had a clear mind, especially toward the end. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The room went quiet. Linda and Marcus exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret, but there was something nervous in their expressions, something that looked almost like fear. "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus asked, his attorney instincts kicking in. I didn't answer. I simply looked around the room at all the faces staring at me, memorizing the expressions of people who had written me off, who had decided that my worth could be measured by my bank account and job title. Then I walked out of the country club, leaving them to continue their celebration without the embarrassment of my presence. I drove home to my small apartment, still wearing the black dress that suddenly felt like armor instead of shame. I made a cup of tea and sat at my tiny kitchen table, thinking about the last conversation I had with Mother just 3 days before she died. She had been lucid that day, more alert than she had been in weeks, and she had asked me to sit beside her bed. "Rose," she had said, taking my hand with fingers that felt like paper but still held surprising strength. "I need you to promise me something." I had leaned closer, expecting her to ask me to take care of myself after she was gone, or to promise that I would try to reconcile with Linda and Marcus. Instead, she had looked into my eyes with an intensity that reminded me of the woman she had been before the cancer stole her energy. "Promise me that you won't let them make you feel worthless," she had whispered. "You are the daughter who stayed. You are the one who saw me at my worst and loved me anyway. That matters more than anything they could ever achieve." At the time, I had thought she was simply trying to comfort me, offering the kind of reassurance that dying parents give to ease their own guilt about leaving. Now, sitting in my quiet apartment with the taste of my siblings' contempt still bitter in my mouth, I wondered if there had been something more deliberate in her words. Something that sounded less like comfort and more like preparation. The next morning, I woke to my phone buzzing with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. The message was brief and formal. "Ms. Rose Patterson, this is Sarah Chen from Chen & Associates Law Firm. Your mother's will is scheduled to be read tomorrow at 2 p.m. Please confirm your attendance." I stared at the message for several minutes, confused. Mother had never mentioned a will reading, and I had assumed that whatever modest assets she had left would be handled privately between Linda and Marcus. They were the ones with power of attorney, the ones who had been managing her finances during her illness. I had never expected to be included in any formal legal proceedings. I called the number back, and a receptionist confirmed that yes, my name was specifically listed in Elizabeth Patterson's will, and yes, my presence was required for the reading. When I asked if Linda and Marcus would be there, the woman's voice became carefully neutral. "All beneficiaries named in the will have been contacted," she said. "The reading will proceed as scheduled regardless of attendance, but it is strongly recommended that all parties be present." I spent the rest of the day trying to imagine what Mother might have left me. Perhaps a piece of jewelry that had belonged to her own mother, or a small savings account that Linda and Marcus didn't know about. Maybe she had set aside enough money to cover my rent for a few months, knowing that I would need time to find a new job after spending 6 months as her caregiver. The possibilities felt both hopeful and terrifying, because even a small inheritance would be more financial security than I had ever known. But underneath my speculation about money and possessions, there was something else. A growing sense that Mother's final words to me had been more than just comfort. A feeling that the woman who had surprised everyone by surviving 6 months longer than her doctors predicted might have one more surprise left. The law office was located in the financial district, in one of those glass towers that I had always associated with Linda and Marcus's world of success and influence. I wore the same black dress from the funeral, partly because it was the only formal clothing I owned, and partly because it felt like a shield. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt endless, and by the time I reached the reception area, my hands were shaking. Linda and Marcus were already there, sitting in leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. They looked up when I entered, and their expressions shifted from surprise to irritation to something that looked almost like panic. Linda's perfectly styled blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a navy suit that screamed, "expensive designer." Marcus was in his usual courtroom armor, a charcoal gray suit with a red tie that he probably thought made him look powerful and authoritative. "What are you doing here?" Linda asked, her voice sharp with accusation. "I was invited," I said, simply taking a seat across from them. Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing furiously. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Mother's affairs should be handled by people who understand financial responsibility. I'm going to call Johnson and find out what kind of mistake this is." Before he could complete his call, a woman in her 40s appeared in the doorway of the conference room. She was Asian American with short black hair and a professional demeanor that somehow managed to be both authoritative and kind. She wore a simple black suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked well used but expensive. "Good afternoon," she said, extending her hand to each of us in turn. "I'm Sarah Chen. Thank you all for coming. If you'll follow me, we can get started." The conference room was exactly what I had expected from a high-end law firm. Floor to ceiling, windows overlooked the city, and the mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine. Sarah Chen took her place at the head of the table and opened her briefcase, removing a thick document and several manila folders. "Before we begin," she said, looking directly at Linda and Marcus, "I want to address what I suspect may be some confusion. Your mother came to see me approximately 4 months ago, well before her condition deteriorated, and she was very clear about her wishes. She specifically instructed me not to discuss the contents of her will with anyone until after her death, including family members." Linda's face flushed red. "That's impossible. We have power of attorney. We've been managing Mother's affairs for over a year." Sarah Chen nodded calmly. "You have power of attorney for medical and financial decisions during your mother's lifetime. That authority ended with her death. The distribution of her estate is governed by her will, which she executed independently." Marcus leaned forward, his attorney instincts taking over. "Who witnessed the will? When was it signed? I want to see documentation of her mental capacity at the time of execution." "All of those questions will be answered," Sarah Chen replied, smoothly. "Your mother anticipated that there might be challenges to her wishes, so she was very thorough in her preparation." She opened the document and began to read in a clear, professional voice. The language was formal and legal, full of phrases like "being of sound mind and body" and "do hereby bequeath," but the content was straightforward enough for even me to understand. Mother's estate was more substantial than any of us had realized. In addition to the house in the hills that we all knew about, she owned a small apartment building that had been generating rental income for over a decade. She had several investment accounts, a life insurance policy, and a savings account that had been growing steadily for years. The total value of her assets was just over $2 million. But what shocked me more than the size of the estate was how it was being distributed. Linda and Marcus each received exactly $50,000, enough to cover the funeral expenses they had already paid and provide a modest inheritance. Everything else, including the house, the rental property, and all financial accounts, was left to me. The silence in the room was deafening. I felt like I was floating above my own body, watching this scene unfold from a great distance. Sarah Chen continued reading, her voice steady and professional, but I could barely process the words. Something about trust funds and financial management, about provisions for my education if I chose to return to school, about specific instructions for maintaining the rental property. When she finished reading, Linda was the first to speak. Her voice was barely controlled, shaking with rage and disbelief. "This is impossible," she said. "There has to be a mistake. Mother would never do this. She knew Rose couldn't handle this kind of responsibility." Marcus was already in full attorney mode, his mind racing through legal possibilities. I want to see the witnesses. I want medical records from the day this was signed. There's no way Mother was competent when she made this decision. Sarah Chen reached into her briefcase and pulled out another folder. Your mother anticipated these concerns, she said calmly. She underwent a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation the day before she signed her will. I have the report here from Dr. Martinez, a court-certified psychiatrist who specializes in testamentary capacity. She was found to be completely competent and fully aware of her decisions. She passed copies of the report to Linda and Marcus, then pulled out another document. She also left personal letters for each of you, to be read after the legal proceedings were complete. My hands were still shaking when Sarah Chen handed me my letter. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, with my name written in Mother's familiar handwriting. I could feel Linda and Marcus staring at me, their shock and anger palpable in the eye. Small conference room. This won't stand, Linda said, her voice rising. We'll contest it. No court would uphold a will that gives everything to someone who can't even hold down a job. You're certainly welcome to try, Sarah Chen replied, her tone remaining professional. However, I should mention that your mother included a no-contest clause in her will. Any beneficiary who challenges the document forfeits their inheritance entirely. Marcus looked like he had been slapped. You mean, if we contest the will, we lose our $50,000? That's correct. I watched my siblings process this information, their faces cycling through disbelief, rage, and calculation. $50,000 was not a life-changing amount for either of them, but it was enough to make them think twice about expensive legal challenges that might result in them receiving nothing at all. Sarah Chen began packing up her documents, signaling that the formal reading was complete. Rose, I'll need to meet with you separately to discuss the practical aspects of managing your inheritance. There are tax implications and legal responsibilities that we should address. I nodded, still feeling like I was in a dream. Linda and Marcus stood to leave, their movements sharp and angry. As they reached the door, Linda turned back to look at me with an expression of pure hatred. This isn't over, she said. You might have fooled Mother into thinking you deserved this, but everyone knows the truth about you. You'll destroy everything she worked for within a year. After they left, Sarah Chen and I sat in the quiet conference room while she explained the details of my inheritance. The house was worth approximately $800,000. The apartment building generated about $6,000 per month in rental income, and the various accounts and investments would provide additional financial security for the rest of my life. Your mother was very specific about her reasons, Sarah Chen said gently. She wanted me to tell you that this wasn't charity or compensation for your caregiving. She said you were the only one of her children who had shown her unconditional love, and she wanted to make sure you would be taken care of. I finally opened Mother's letter, my hands steady now for the first time since I had walked into the law office. Her handwriting was shaky but clear, and her words were exactly what I needed to hear. My dearest Rose, the letter began. If you are reading this, then you know that I saved my biggest surprise for last. I hope you understand that this decision wasn't made lightly or in haste. It was the result of months of careful consideration and a lifetime of watching my children choose their paths. Linda and Marcus have built successful lives according to society's standards, and I am proud of their achievements. But success that comes at the cost of compassion is hollow, and wealth that breeds entitlement is dangerous. They have everything they need to continue their lives exactly as they choose. You, my darling girl, have given me something your siblings never could. You gave me your presence when I was dying, your patience when I was difficult, and your love when I was no longer the strong woman who raised you. You sacrificed your own opportunities to make sure I didn't face the end alone, and that is a gift worth more than any inheritance. But this is not payment for services rendered. This is recognition of who you are at your core. You are the daughter who stayed not because you had to, but because you wanted to. You are the one who saw past my illness to the person I still was inside. You are the child who loved me not for what I could give you, but for who I was. Use this gift wisely, not just the money, but the freedom it represents. Go back to school if you want to. Travel if that calls to you. Start a business, write a book, help other people the way you helped me. The specific choice doesn't matter as much as the fact that now you can choose. And remember, when Linda and Marcus inevitably tell you that you don't deserve this, that their anger comes from a place of regret they may never acknowledge. They are angry at themselves for the opportunities they missed to know me as a person, rather than just as their mother. They are angry that they chose achievement over relationship. And now it's too late to go back. You don't need to forgive them immediately, and you don't need to share your inheritance with them if you don't want to. But I hope that someday you can find peace with their choices, because holding on to anger will only diminish the joy this gift should bring you. I love you, Rose. I have always loved you, even when I didn't know how to show it properly. You were the daughter who saw me most clearly, and now I want you to see yourself the same way. All my love, Mother. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. Sarah Chen had been patient while I read, and now she smiled warmly. She was very proud of you, she said. She talked about you constantly during our meetings. She wanted to make sure this transition would be as smooth as possible for you. I left the law office in a daze, walking through the financial district like a tourist in my own life. Everything looked the same, but I felt fundamentally different, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. I drove home to my small apartment above the dry cleaner, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a stopping point, a place I had been waiting to leave without knowing where I was going. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and Mother's letter, reading it again and again until I had memorized every word. I thought about Linda and Marcus, probably at home telling their spouses about the injustice of Mother's decision, painting me as a manipulative opportunist who had somehow tricked a dying woman into changing her will. But I also thought about Mrs. Henderson's words at the funeral, about Mother seeing what I had sacrificed. I thought about the late nights when Mother couldn't sleep and we would talk about her childhood, her dreams, her regrets. I thought about the morning she woke up crying because she had dreamed about her own mother, and how I had held her until the sadness passed. Those moments hadn't been calculated or strategic. I hadn't been building a case for inheritance or trying to position myself as the favored child. I had simply been present for someone I loved during the most difficult time of her life. If that presence had earned me something I had never expected, then perhaps Mother was right that I had shown her unconditional love. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Mrs. Henderson's name, and I answered cautiously. "Rose, dear." Her voice was warm but concerned. "I heard about the will reading today. Are you all right?" I wasn't sure how she had found out so quickly, but gossip traveled fast in Mother's social circle. "I'm fine," I said, still processing everything. "I'm sure you are. Listen, I want you to know that your mother talked to me about her decision several months ago. She was worried about how Linda and Marcus would react, but she was confident that she was doing the right thing." Mrs. Henderson paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Your mother told me that you were the only one of her children who had ever seen her as a person, rather than just as a parent. She said Linda and Marcus loved the idea of her, the successful mother who had raised successful children, but that you loved her for who she actually was, flaws and all." After we hung up, I realized that Mother's gift wasn't just financial security. It was validation. For 38 years, I had felt like the family failure, the daughter who couldn't measure up to her siblings' achievements. I had internalized their assessment of my worth, believing that my unconventional choices and modest lifestyle somehow made me less valuable as a person. But Mother had seen something different. She had seen a daughter who prioritized relationships over achievements, who chose presence over prestige, who measured success by the quality of love rather than the quantity of possessions. And in her final act as my mother, she had made sure the world would see me that way too. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't because of anxiety or stress. I lay awake thinking about possibilities, about the life I could build with the freedom Mother had given me. I could go back to nursing school and finish the degree I had abandoned to care for her. I could travel to places I had only seen in magazines. I could start a nonprofit to help other caregivers who sacrifice their own opportunities to help family members. For the first time in my adult life, I could make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. The Heir feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff with wings I had never learned to use. But underneath the excitement and possibility, there was something else. A quiet sense of justice that felt like Mother's final gift to me. Linda and Marcus had spent years treating me like the embarrassing relative who was tolerated out of family obligation. They had made it clear that they saw me as a burden, a disappointment, someone whose presence diminished their own accomplishments. Now they would have to watch me inherit everything they had assumed would be theirs. They would have to explain to their friends and colleagues why their mother had chosen to trust her substantial estate to the daughter they had publicly dismissed as irresponsible. They would have to face the possibility that their assessment of my worth had been wrong, or worse, that Mother's assessment of their character had been more accurate than they wanted to admit. I wasn't vindictive by nature, and I didn't take pleasure in their pain. But I couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in knowing that their assumptions about family hierarchy and inheritance had been completely overturned. The sister they had treated like a child would now control assets they had never dreamed existed. The daughter they had written off as a failure would have more financial security than either of them had achieved through their successful careers. As the sun began to rise through my small apartment window, I made my first decision as a wealthy woman. I would not apologize for Mother's choice, and I would not let Linda and Marcus make me feel guilty for accepting it. I would honor Mother's gift by using it wisely and living the life she had wanted for me. The daughter who had been dismissed and overlooked was about to disappear forever. In her place would be a woman with choices, with power, with the freedom to define success on her own terms. And if that transformation made my siblings uncomfortable, if it challenged their assumptions about worth and family dynamics, then perhaps that was exactly what Mother had intended all along. The first sign that Linda and Marcus weren't accepting Mother's decision quietly came 3 days after the will reading. I was sitting in Mother's kitchen, surrounded by boxes and trying to decide which of her belongings to keep, when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the lace curtains, I could see Marcus's silver BMW parked behind my Honda, and my stomach immediately tightened with dread. I had been avoiding their calls since leaving the law office, partly because I needed time to process everything that had happened, and partly because I knew any conversation with them would be ugly. They had left increasingly hostile voicemails, demanding explanations, threatening legal action, and accusing me of manipulating Mother during her illness. Linda's messages were particularly vicious, filled with personal attacks and predictions about my inevitable failure as an heiress. Marcus knocked on the front door with the sharp, authoritative rhythm he probably used when serving legal papers. I considered not answering, but this was my house now, and I couldn't hide from my siblings forever. When I opened the door, both Linda and Marcus stood on the porch, their faces set in expressions of cold determination. "We need to talk," Marcus said, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. Linda followed, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with aggressive precision. She was dressed for battle in a severe black suit with her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Marcus wore his courtroom armor again, the charcoal suit and red tie that he seemed to think made him look intimidating. "You can't seriously believe you're going to keep all of this," Linda said, gesturing around the living room with obvious disdain. "Look at this place, Rose. Look at yourself. You're wearing the same dress you wore to the funeral 3 days ago." I glanced down at my black dress, realizing she was right. I had been so overwhelmed by the inheritance that I hadn't thought about mundane things like laundry or changing clothes. The admission made me feel foolish, exactly the way Linda intended. Marcus walked through the living room like he was conducting an inspection, picking up Mother's crystal figurines and examining them with the calculating eye of someone appraising assets. "The responsible thing to do would be to split the estate equally among the three of us," he said without looking at me. That's what any reasonable person would have expected. "But Mother didn't want it split equally," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. She made her wishes very clear. Linda laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the room. "Mother was dying, Rose. She was on heavy pain medication and probably not thinking clearly. You took advantage of a sick, vulnerable woman, and now you're pretending it was her idea." I felt the familiar heat of shame rising in my cheeks. This was the dynamic I had grown up with, Linda and Marcus presenting a united front of superiority, while I struggled to defend myself against their coordinated attacks. They had perfected this technique over decades, tag-teaming me with accusations and criticisms until I inevitably broke down or backed down. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Mother's letter, still folded in my purse, reminding me that someone had seen value in my choices. Maybe it was the simple fact that I was standing in my own house, surrounded by my own belongings, holding legal documents that proved my worth in black and white. Whatever it was, I felt a spark of resistance that I hadn't experienced in years. "Mother wasn't on pain medication when she visited the lawyer," I said, my voice stronger now. "That was 4 months before she died, when she was still driving herself to appointments and managing her own affairs. The psychiatric evaluation proves she was completely competent." Marcus's face flushed red, and I could see him struggling to control his temper. A psychiatric evaluation that conveniently found exactly what you needed it to find. I wonder how much it cost to buy that opinion. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. He was suggesting that I had somehow bribed a doctor to declare Mother competent, that I had orchestrated an elaborate fraud to steal my siblings' inheritance. The worst part was that he seemed to genuinely believe it, as if the only possible explanation for Mother's decision was criminal manipulation on my part. "I didn't even know about the inheritance until the will was read," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I was just as surprised as you were." Linda moved closer, invading my personal space in a way that made me want to step backward. "Oh, please," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You spent 6 months alone with her, filling her head with sob stories about your pathetic life. You made her feel guilty for our success, convinced her that you were the victim and we were the villains." I did step backward then, bumping against the wall beside Mother's bookshelf. The same bookshelf where her photos still sat, images of all 3 of her children at various stages of our lives. In the pictures, we looked like a normal, happy family, nothing like the war zone we had become. "That's not what happened," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "I'm sending you a contract," he said without looking up. "You're going to sign over 2/3 of the estate to Linda and me, keeping what amounts to a reasonable inheritance for yourself. In exchange, we won't pursue legal action that could tie up everything in court for years." I stared at him, struggling to process what he had just said. "You want me to give you Mother's house and her? Rental property?" "We want what's rightfully ours," Linda snapped. "What any reasonable person would have expected from a fair distribution of assets." "But it's not about what you expected," I said, finding my voice again. "It's about what Mother wanted. She had reasons for her decision, and they were valid. Reasons? Marcus looked up from his phone, his expression shifting into the cold, predatory stare he probably used to intimidate witnesses. What reasons, Rose? What could possibly justify giving everything to the daughter who never held a steady job, never got married, never contributed anything meaningful to society? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized this was the moment when I would either defend myself or crumble under their assault. For 38 years, I had accepted their assessment of my worth, believing that my unconventional choices somehow made me less valuable than my successful siblings. But Mother's letter had shown me a different perspective, one where love and presence mattered more than achievement and accumulation. She gave it to me because I was the one who stayed, I said, my voice steady for the first time since they had arrived. Because I was the one who held her hand during chemotherapy, who helped her shower when she was too weak to stand alone, who listened to her stories about her childhood when she couldn't sleep at night. Linda rolled her eyes with theatrical disgust. Oh, here we go with the martyr routine. You weren't sacrificing anything, Rose. You didn't have a career to interrupt or a family to neglect. Taking care of Mother was literally the only useful thing you've ever done. The cruelty of the statement took my breath away. She was dismissing 6 months of exhausting, heartbreaking work as if it had been nothing more than an extended vacation. She was reducing the most meaningful period of my adult life to a desperate attempt to find purpose in failure. But instead of devastating me, her words clarified something important. Linda and Marcus genuinely couldn't understand why Mother had valued my presence during her final months. To them, caregiving was a chore to be delegated or avoided, not an expression of love that required sacrifice and commitment. They couldn't see the worth in what I had done because they had never done it themselves. You're right, I said, surprising them with my agreement. I didn't have a career to interrupt or a family to neglect. That's exactly why Mother knew I would be there for her when she needed someone most. Marcus's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen with satisfaction. I just sent you the contract. You have 24 hours to sign it, or we file a formal challenge to the will. He handed me a business card for a law firm I didn't recognize. These are the attorneys who will be representing us. They specialize in estate litigation, and they're very good at proving testamentary incapacity in cases involving undue influence. Linda moved toward the door, her mission apparently complete. Think carefully, Rose. A legal battle will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, and there's no guarantee you'll win. Take the reasonable settlement we're offering, and everyone can walk away with something. After they left, I sat in Mother's living room for over an hour, holding Marcus's business card and trying to understand what had just happened. They weren't just asking me to share the inheritance. They were demanding that I surrender most of it under threat of expensive litigation. They were gambling that I would be too intimidated or too poor to fight them in court. I called Sarah Chen, who answered on the second ring despite the late hour. They're threatening to challenge the will, I told her, reading Marcus's contract over the phone. I expected as much, she said calmly. Your mother anticipated this possibility and prepared accordingly. Do you remember the no contest clause I mentioned? If they challenge the will, they lose their $50,000. Exactly. But more importantly, your mother left detailed documentation of her reasoning for the distribution. She wrote letters explaining her decision, recorded video statements, and provided extensive evidence of her mental capacity at the time the will was executed. Sarah Chen paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Rose, I need to ask you a difficult question. Are you prepared to fight for this inheritance? Because if you are, we have an extremely strong case. But if you're not, if you'd rather avoid conflict and take a settlement, I need to know that now. I thought about Mother's letter, about her confidence that I deserved this gift, about her hope that I would use it to build a life based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. I thought about Linda and Marcus, so certain of their superiority, so convinced that financial success was the only meaningful measure of worth. "I'm prepared to fight," I said, and I meant it. The next morning, I woke up in Mother's bed for the first time since her death. I had been sleeping on the couch, unable to bring myself to occupy the space where she had spent her final weeks. But something about my conversation with Sarah Chen had given me the courage to reclaim the entire house as my own. I made coffee in Mother's kitchen, using her favorite mug, and sat at the breakfast table where we had shared so many quiet mornings during her illness. The view through the window showed the garden she had tended for 30 years, now overgrown and neglected but still beautiful in its wild abundance. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Contract deadline is 6 p.m. today. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Instead of responding, I forwarded the message to Sarah Chen and blocked Marcus's number. Then I did the same with Linda's. If they wanted to communicate with me about legal matters, they could go through my attorney. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to listen to their criticism or defend my choices to people who had already decided I was worthless. The inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had given me the power to set boundaries with people who had never respected them. I spent the morning exploring the house with fresh eyes, seeing it not as Mother's space that I was temporarily occupying, but as my own home that I could modify and improve as I chose. The master bedroom could be redecorated in colors I loved, instead of Mother's preferred pastels. The small den could become an office where I could manage my rental properties or pursue the online degree I had always wanted to complete. Most importantly, I could invite people into this space who valued me for who I was rather than tolerating me out of family obligation. Mrs. Henderson had already called to ask if I needed help sorting through Mother's belongings. My former colleague from the home health agency had texted congratulations and offered to take me out for a celebration dinner. These were people who had seen my worth long before I inherited money to prove it. That afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. That turned out to be a reporter from the local newspaper. Somehow, word of the inheritance dispute had leaked, and she wanted to interview me about the family conflict. "I understand there's been some controversy about your mother's will," she said in the professionally neutral tone reporters use when fishing for drama. "Your siblings have been quite vocal about their belief that the distribution was unfair." I almost hung up immediately, but something stopped me. Linda and Marcus had been telling their version of the story to anyone who would listen, painting me as a manipulative opportunist who had taken advantage of a dying woman. Maybe it was time for people to hear my side. "My mother made her decision based on her own values and priorities," I said carefully. She left detailed explanations of her reasoning, and she was thoroughly evaluated for mental capacity when she executed her will. "But your siblings seem to believe that you exerted undue influence during her final illness. How do you respond to those allegations?" I thought about the late nights when Mother couldn't sleep, the conversations about her childhood, the quiet moments when she had thanked me for staying with her. None of those memories felt like manipulation. They felt like love. "I was present for my mother during the most difficult period of her life," I said. "I don't consider that undue influence. I consider it family responsibility." The article appeared 2 days later, and it was more balanced than I had expected. The reporter had clearly done her research, noting that Mother's will included extensive documentation and psychiatric evaluation. She had also interviewed Mrs. Henderson, who spoke eloquently about my dedication during Mother's illness. But the article also included quotes from Linda and Marcus that made my stomach churn. Linda called me a lifelong underachiever who finally found a way to profit from failure. Marcus suggested that Mother's generosity toward me had been misguided compassion for a daughter who never learned to take responsibility for her own life. Reading their words in print was somehow more devastating than hearing them in person. They weren't just angry about losing their expected inheritance. They genuinely believed that I was an unworthy person who had stolen something that belonged to them. The depth of their contempt was breathtaking. But the article also included something unexpected: comments from other family members who supported Mother's decision. My cousin Jennifer, who lived across the country and had rarely been involved in family drama, was quoted saying that she had always admired my willingness to prioritize relationships over career advancement. Uncle Robert, Mother's younger brother, said he thought Mother's distribution reflected her values perfectly. Most surprising was a quote from Mother's longtime housekeeper, Maria, who had worked for the family for over 15 years. She told the reporter that she had watched all 3 children interact with Mother over the years, and that I was the only one who had ever treated her like a person rather than a service provider. Rose would sit and talk with Mrs. Patterson about everything, Maria said. The other children, they would visit and talk about their jobs, their problems, what they needed from their mother. But Rose, she would ask about Mrs. Patterson's day, her feelings, her memories. She saw her mother as a whole person. Reading Maria's words brought tears to my eyes. I had never realized that anyone outside the immediate family had been paying attention to these dynamics. But Maria had witnessed years of interactions that proved Mother's assessment of her children had been accurate. The article seemed to shift public opinion slightly in my favor, or at least introduce some doubt about Linda and Marcus's narrative. I received several messages of support from people I barely knew, including former clients from my home health work who said they understood the value of what I had done for Mother. But Linda and Marcus responded to the article with escalated aggression. Linda posted a long statement on social media calling the reporter biased and accusing me of manipulating the media just as I had manipulated Mother. Marcus sent me a formal letter through his law firm informing me that they were proceeding with their challenge to the will and that I should prepare for aggressive litigation. Sarah Chen called that evening to discuss their challenge, which had been filed that morning. They're claiming undue influence and diminished capacity, she said. Exactly what we expected. They're also requesting a full forensic accounting of your mother's finances for the 2 years before her death. What does that mean? They're looking for evidence that you somehow coerced her into changing her financial arrangements. They want to examine every check she wrote, every investment decision she made, looking for signs that you were controlling her money. I felt a chill of panic. What if they find something that looks suspicious? Rose, your mother kept meticulous records, and she anticipated this exact scenario. Every significant financial decision she made during her illness was documented and justified. She even recorded video explanations of major transactions to prove she was acting independently. Sarah Chen's confidence was reassuring, but I still felt overwhelmed by the prospect of months or years of legal battles. How long will this take? Estate litigation can be unpredictable, but given the strength of our evidence, I expect we'll be able to resolve this relatively quickly. The other side is operating on emotion and assumptions rather than facts. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house that was legally mine but still felt like Mother's, touching the furniture she had chosen, looking at the photos she had arranged, wondering if I was strong enough to defend her final wishes against the children she had raised. In the guest room that had been my bedroom during Mother's illness, I found a journal I had kept during those final months. I had written in it sporadically, usually when I was too tired or too sad to sleep, recording the small moments that had made up our days together. Reading those entries now, I could see the progression of our relationship from caregiver and patient to something deeper and more meaningful. The early entries were mostly practical, noting medication schedules and doctor appointments. But as the weeks passed, the journal became a record of conversations, observations, and moments of connection that had meant everything to me at the time. One entry, written just 3 weeks before Mother died, stood out. Mother told me today that she regrets not being a better mother when I was young. She said she was so focused on Linda and Marcus's achievements that she never paid enough attention to my different kind of strength. She said she always knew I was the most emotionally intelligent of her children, but she didn't know how to nurture that gift because it wasn't something she understood. I told her it was never too late for us to know each other better, and she cried. Good tears, I think. I closed the journal and held it against my chest, remembering that conversation and dozens of others like it. Linda and Marcus could accuse me of manipulation, but they couldn't change the reality of what Mother and I had shared during those final months. They couldn't diminish the value of presence, of patience, of unconditional love offered without expectation of reward. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of legal meetings, document reviews, and depositions. Sarah Chen had been right about the strength of our case. Mother's documentation was extraordinary in its thoroughness and clarity. She had not only explained her reasoning for the inheritance distribution, but had also provided evidence of Linda and Marcus's behavior toward her over the years. There were copies of emails where they had declined family gatherings because they were too busy with work. There were recorded phone conversations where they had dismissed her concerns about her health as attention-seeking behavior. There was even a particularly damaging voicemail from Linda, left just 2 months before Mother's death, where she complained about the inconvenience of Mother's illness and suggested that she consider moving to a nursing facility. But perhaps most compelling were the video recordings Mother had made during her final months, speaking directly to a camera about her relationships with her children and her reasons for structuring her will as she had. In one video, recorded just 6 weeks before her death, Mother looked directly into the camera with clear, alert eyes and spoke with the same firm voice I remembered from my childhood. I want to make it clear that my decisions about my estate reflect my own values and observations, she said. I have 3 children, and I love them all, but they have chosen very different paths in life. Linda and Marcus have built successful careers and accumulated wealth and status that I admire. They have followed the path that society rewards, and they have been rewarded accordingly. Rose has chosen a different path, one that prioritizes relationships and service over accumulation and achievement. Society doesn't reward this choice financially, but I believe it has value that transcends money. Rose has shown me a kind of love that doesn't depend on what I can give her or how I can advance her interests. She has loved me for who I am, not what I represent. I am giving Rose the majority of my estate not because she needs it more than her siblings, though that is certainly true, but because I want to make a statement about the kinds of values I want to support. I want to reward the choice to prioritize love over achievement, presence over productivity, relationship over recognition. Linda and Marcus have never needed my approval or my financial support to feel valuable and worthy. They have found those things in their careers and their social status. But Rose has spent her entire adult life feeling like a failure because she doesn't measure up to conventional standards of success. I want her to know that her way of living has value, and I want to give her the freedom to continue choosing love over profit without worrying about survival. Watching that video in Sarah Chen's office, surrounded by lawyers and legal documents, I felt Mother's presence more strongly than I had since her death. She had not only anticipated the battle I would face, but had armed me with everything I needed to win it. The turning point in the legal challenge came when Linda and Marcus were deposed about their relationship with Mother during her final years. Under oath, they were forced to admit that their visits had been infrequent and brief, that they had often seemed more interested in discussing their own lives than in learning about Mother's experience of her illness. Marcus, in particular, struggled under questioning about his limited involvement in Mother's care. When asked why he had never offered to help with her medical appointments or daily needs, he became defensive and argumentative. "That's not the kind of relationship we had," he said. "I'm not a caregiver. I provided other kinds of support." "What kinds of support?" Sarah Chen asked. "Legal advice, financial consultation, professional expertise. Did your mother ask for legal advice during her illness? Not specifically, but did she ask for financial consultation? She knew she could call me if she needed anything. But she didn't call you, did she? In fact, according to phone records, you spoke with your mother fewer than a dozen times during the 6 months before her death. Marcus's deposition transcript made for damaging reading. He came across as cold and distant, a son who had delegated the emotional work of family relationships while expecting to inherit the rewards of filial devotion. Linda's deposition was even worse. She seemed genuinely surprised by questions about mother's interests, hobbies, and daily routines during her illness. When asked about mother's emotional state or fears about dying, Linda repeatedly responded that those weren't topics they discussed. "What did you discuss during your visits?" Sarah Chen asked. "Normal things. Family news, work updates, general conversation." "Did you ever ask your mother how she was feeling about her diagnosis?" "I assumed she would tell me if she wanted to talk about it." "Did you ever offer to help with her medical care?" Rose was handling all of that. It didn't seem necessary. Reading Linda's transcript, I was struck by how foreign her description of mother sounded. She talked about our mother like a distant acquaintance rather than the woman who had raised her, as if emotional intimacy was an imposition rather than a natural part of family relationships. The contrast with my own deposition was stark. I was able to provide detailed accounts of mother's fears, hopes, and daily experiences during her illness. I could describe her favorite TV shows, the foods that still appealed to her when chemotherapy destroyed her appetite, the stories she told about her childhood when pain kept her awake at night. More importantly, I could explain why mother might have valued our relationship differently than her relationships with Linda and Marcus. I had seen her as a complete person during her illness, not just as my mother, but as a woman facing her own mortality with courage and grace. I had been interested in her inner life, her memories, her perspective on the world. 3 months after the legal challenge was filed, Sarah Chen called with news that the case was being settled. Linda and Marcus had agreed to drop their challenge in exchange for keeping their original $50,000 inheritance. They realized they couldn't win, Sarah Chen explained. The evidence was too overwhelming, and they were facing the possibility of losing everything if they continued. Their attorneys advised them to take the settlement. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the legal battle was over and that mother's wishes would be respected. Sadness that my relationship with Linda and Marcus had been permanently destroyed by their inability to accept mother's decision. But mostly, I felt vindicated. Mother's assessment of her children had been proven accurate in the most public way possible. The daughter they had dismissed as a failure had defended her inheritance successfully, while the children they had considered successful had been revealed as distant and self-serving. The day the settlement was finalized, I received a letter from Linda. It was brief and bitter, a final attempt to have the last word in our family drama. "I hope you're satisfied," she wrote. "You've gotten what you wanted, and you've destroyed our family in the process. Mother would be ashamed of what you've become." I read the letter once and then threw it away. Linda was wrong about everything, but especially about Mother's feelings. I had become exactly what Mother hoped I would become. A woman strong enough to fight for what she believed in, wise enough to value love over approval, and confident enough to build a life based on her own principles rather than other people's expectations. That evening, I sat on the back porch of my house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The garden that Mother had loved was beginning to show signs of my care. The weeds cleared away to reveal the roses and lavender she had planted decades ago. My phone rang, and I saw Mrs. Henderson's name on the caller ID. "I heard the good news," she said, her voice warm with genuine happiness. "Your mother would be so proud of how you handled all of this." "Thank you," I said. "I hope you're right." I know I'm right. Your mother always said you were stronger than you realized. She just wanted to make sure you had the chance to prove it to yourself. After we hung up, I thought about Mother's final gift to me. It hadn't just been money or property. It had been the opportunity to discover my own strength, to defend my own worth, to claim my place in the world without apology or explanation. The girl who had been dismissed and overlooked was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew her own value, who could set boundaries with people who didn't respect her, who had the freedom to choose how to spend her time and energy. I had inherited more than an estate. I had inherited the right to define success on my own terms, to measure worth by love rather than achievement, to build a life that honored the values Mother had seen in me from the beginning. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and I went inside to begin planning the rest of my life. Tomorrow, I would start researching nursing programs. I would call the contractor about updating the kitchen. I would visit the rental properties and meet the tenants who were now my responsibility. But tonight, I would simply sit in my own house, surrounded by my own belongings, grateful for the mother who had seen my worth when no one else could, and who had made sure the world would see it too. The transformation was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. I was no longer the daughter who had been tolerated out of family obligation. I was the heir to everything that mattered, and I finally understood that everything that mattered had never been about money at all. 6 months after the settlement, I was driving through downtown when I saw Linda coming out of an upscale restaurant with a group of women I recognized from Mother's Bridge Club. For a moment, our eyes met through the car window, and I saw something in her expression that I had never seen before: uncertainty. I could have driven past without acknowledgement, treating her with the same dismissive indifference she had shown me for years. Instead, I found myself pulling over and walking toward her, not out of anger or vindictiveness, but out of curiosity about who we might be to each other now that the power dynamics had shifted so completely. Linda's friends made their excuses and left quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of witnessing a family confrontation. Linda and I stood alone on the sidewalk, two women who shared blood and history but had become strangers to each other. "You look good," Linda said, and there was something almost like surprise in her voice. I did look good. The chronic stress that had marked my face for years had faded, replaced by the glow of someone who sleeps well and wakes up excited about the day ahead. I had been eating better, exercising regularly, and taking care of myself in ways I had never been able to afford before. "Thank you," I said. "How are you doing?" She shrugged, a gesture that seemed uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Fine, busy with work, the usual." We stood in awkward silence for a moment, and I realized that Linda didn't know how to talk to me now that I wasn't the family failure she could dismiss and ignore. My success, both financial and personal, had disrupted the narrative she had built about our family hierarchy. "I've been thinking about what Mother said in that video," Linda said suddenly, "about the different paths we chose." I waited, not sure where this conversation was heading. I spent so much time trying to make her proud of my achievements that I never stopped to wonder if she was actually proud of who I was as a person. Linda's voice was quiet, almost contemplative. "You were the only one who seemed interested in knowing her as more than just our mother." The admission surprised me. I had expected continued hostility or attempts at manipulation, not this moment of what seemed like genuine reflection. "It's not too late to get to know people differently," I said. "Death has a way of clarifying what actually matters." Linda looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Maybe, but some opportunities don't come back once they're gone." She started to walk away, then turned back. "For what it's worth, I think Mother was right about you. You always were the strongest of us, even when we couldn't see it." I watched her disappear into the crowd of downtown shoppers, wondering if this brief conversation represented the beginning of healing or simply the acknowledgement of permanent loss. Either way, it felt like closure of a sort, the final recognition that the family dynamics I had grown up with no longer existed. That evening, I called Mrs. Henderson to tell her about the encounter with Linda. "People can surprise you," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it takes a shock to make us examine the assumptions we've been living with." "Do you think Linda and I could ever have a real relationship?" Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment. "I think that depends on whether she's capable of accepting that worth can't be measured only by conventional success. Your mother's gift to you was more than money, Rose. It was a public statement about values that challenges everything Linda and Marcus believed about themselves." I understood what she meant. Mother's will had forced Linda and Marcus to confront the possibility that their definitions of success and failure might be incomplete or misguided. The sister they had pitied and dismissed had been revealed as the daughter their mother valued most, not despite her unconventional choices, but because of them. 3 days later, I received an unexpected email from Marcus. The subject line read, "Apology," and I opened it with equal parts curiosity and skepticism. "Rose," the message began, "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the settlement, and I owe you an apology. Not just for the legal challenge, though that was wrong, but for years of treating you like your choices made you less valuable than Linda and me. I've been successful by most measures, but watching you handle the inheritance and everything that came with it has made me realize that success without character is meaningless. You showed grace under pressure that I'm not sure I could have managed. Mother was right to trust you with her legacy. You've proven that you understand what really matters in ways that Linda and I never learned. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I see you differently now, and I see myself differently too. I hope you're building the life Mother wanted for you. Marcus." I read the email 3 times, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas, but it seemed genuine. The language was simpler and more direct than Marcus usually used, as if he had stripped away his lawyer persona to write something real. I didn't reply immediately. I needed time to process this unexpected shift in my siblings' attitudes toward me. For 38 years, I had been the family disappointment, the sister who couldn't measure up to their standards of achievement. Now, suddenly, they were questioning those standards and acknowledging value in choices they had previously dismissed. The change felt surreal, like waking up to discover that gravity had been reversed overnight. I had spent so much energy defending myself against their criticism that I wasn't sure how to respond to their recognition. But as I thought about it more, I realized that their opinions of me no longer mattered as much as they once had. Mother's inheritance had given me something more valuable than their approval: the confidence to approve of myself. I was building a life based on my own values now, making choices that felt authentic rather than defensive. I had enrolled in an online nursing program and was genuinely excited about completing my degree. I had hired a property management company to help me learn how to run the rental business responsibly. I had even started dating someone I met at a community gardening class, a kind man who was interested in my thoughts and feelings rather than my financial status. Most importantly, I had established relationships with people who valued the same things I valued. The community of caregivers I had worked with as a home health aide had become a source of real friendship and support. The elderly clients I had cared for over the years had taught me lessons about resilience and dignity that no amount of money could buy. I finally replied to Marcus's email with a brief message. "Thank you for writing this. I hope we can all move forward with better understanding of each other." I didn't offer forgiveness or the promise of renewed family relationships because I wasn't sure those things were possible or even desirable. Too much damage had been done. Too many hurtful words had been spoken. Too many years had been spent, making me feel small and worthless. But I could acknowledge their growth without sacrificing my own boundaries. I could appreciate their new perspective without forgetting the pain their old perspective had caused. A year after Mother's death, I hosted a small memorial gathering in her garden. I invited Mrs. Henderson, Maria the housekeeper, a few of Mother's close friends, and some of the neighbors who had known her for decades. I did not invite Linda and Marcus. We shared stories about Mother that had nothing to do with her role as a parent and everything to do with who she was as a person. Mrs. Henderson talked about Mother's involvement in local charities and her quiet generosity toward families in need. Maria shared memories of Mother's kindness and her interest in Maria's own family and struggles. The neighbors remembered Mother's beautiful garden and how she would share vegetables and flowers with anyone who expressed interest. One woman told a story about how Mother had noticed her struggling with depression after her husband's death and had started bringing fresh bread every Wednesday, not with pity or obligation, but with genuine friendship and concern. As I listened to these stories, I realized that Mother had lived the same values she had recognized in me. She had prioritized relationships over recognition, had chosen kindness over status, had measured her worth by the love she gave rather than the achievements she accumulated. No wonder she had understood the value of my choices when Linda and Marcus couldn't see past conventional markers of success. The memorial gathering felt like a celebration of everything Mother had truly cared about. There was no formal program, no eulogies about professional accomplishments or social standing. Instead, there was laughter and tears and the kind of authentic, human connection that Mother had always valued most. After everyone left, I sat alone in the garden as the sun set behind the mountains, feeling Mother's presence more strongly than I had since her death. The roses she had planted 20 years ago were blooming magnificently, their fragrance filling the warm evening air. The vegetable garden I had restored was producing tomatoes and herbs that I shared with neighbors just as Mother had done. This was what she had wanted for me. Not just financial security, but the freedom to live according to my own values without worrying about survival or approval. She had given me the gift of choice, and I was finally learning how to use it wisely. 2 weeks after the memorial gathering, I received a phone call that would change everything once again. The caller identified herself as Dr. Patricia Williams, a social worker at the county hospital where I had once worked as a home health aide. "Rose, I hope you remember me," she said. "We worked together several times when you were caring for discharged patients who needed transitional support." I did remember Dr. Williams, a compassionate woman in her 50s who had always treated home health aides with respect and appreciation that was rare in the medical field. She had been one of the few professionals who understood that caring for vulnerable people required emotional intelligence and dedication that couldn't be taught in medical school. "Of course I remember you," I said. "How are you doing?" "I'm well, thank you. But I'm calling because I have a proposition for you, and I hope you'll consider it seriously." Dr. Williams paused, and I could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "I've been following your story in the news, and I know about your mother's passing and your inheritance. I also know about your plans to return to nursing school. I wondered where this conversation was heading." "Yes, I'm starting classes in the fall. Rose, what I'm about to propose might sound overwhelming, but I think you're uniquely qualified for something we desperately need in this community." Dr. Williams's voice took on an intensity that made me pay closer attention. "We've been trying for years to establish a comprehensive support program for elderly people who are transitioning from hospital care back to their homes. These patients often fall through the cracks in our healthcare system because they need more than medical treatment, but less than full nursing home care." She explained that the program would provide temporary housing, emotional support, and practical assistance for elderly people who had no family or whose families couldn't provide adequate care. It would bridge the gap between hospital discharge and successful independent living, offering everything from medication management to grocery shopping to simple companionship. "The county has finally approved funding for a pilot program," Dr. Williams continued. "We have a building, we have medical support, And we have social work staff. What we don't have is someone to run the program who understands both the practical and emotional needs of this population. I felt my heart rate accelerate as I began to understand what she was asking. You want me to run this program? I want you to design and run this program, she said. Your experience as a caregiver, your educational background, and your personal understanding of what families go through during end-of-life care make you perfect for this role. And your inheritance gives you the financial freedom to take on a position that might not pay as much as private sector work, but could make an enormous difference in people's lives. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. I had never managed a program or supervised staff or dealt with county bureaucracy, but I had cared for dozens of elderly people over the years, and I had seen firsthand how the gaps in our healthcare system left vulnerable people without the support they needed to maintain their dignity and independence. Can I think about it? I asked. Of course. But Rose, I hope you'll seriously consider this opportunity. You have gifts that our community needs, and this program could be your chance to use those gifts on a larger scale. After we hung up, I walked through Mother's house, thinking about Dr. Williams's proposal. The rooms that had once felt too large and too quiet now seemed full of possibility. I could see the spare bedrooms converted into temporary housing for program participants. I could imagine the living room filled with support groups and educational workshops. The kitchen could serve meals that brought people together rather than simply providing nutrition. But more than the practical possibilities, I was excited by the chance to create something that reflected the values Mother had recognized in me. This program would prioritize relationships over efficiency, would measure success by quality of life rather than quantity of services, would treat elderly people as whole human beings rather than just medical problems to be solved. I called Sarah Chen to discuss the legal and financial implications of taking on such a role. She was enthusiastic about the idea and helped me understand how my inheritance could support the program in ways that government funding couldn't. You could supplement the county funding with your own resources, she explained. That would give you more flexibility in programming and allow you to provide services that bureaucracy might not approve. I spent the next week researching similar programs in other cities, reading about best practices in transitional care, and imagining how I could adapt those models to fit our community's specific needs. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this was exactly the kind of work Mother had hoped I would do with my newfound freedom. But I also realized that accepting this opportunity would mean making myself visible in a way I had never been comfortable with before. Running a county program would require me to speak at public meetings, to advocate for funding, to represent vulnerable people in political contexts where their needs might not be popular or profitable. The shy, insecure woman who had hidden in the back of Mother's funeral would have to become a confident leader who could fight for resources and respect for people society often overlooked. It was a transformation that seemed almost impossible. But Mother's inheritance had already proved that impossible things could happen when someone believed in your potential. I called Dr. Williams back 3 days later and accepted the position. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of meetings, planning sessions, and bureaucratic negotiations that tested every skill I had never known I possessed. I discovered that I was surprisingly good at budget management, staff supervision, and the kind of diplomatic problem-solving that county work required. More importantly, I found that my years of direct caregiving experience gave me credibility with both the people we served and the professionals we worked with. When I spoke about the emotional needs of elderly people transitioning from hospital to home, doctors and social workers listened because they knew I had been there, had held hands and wiped tears, and sat quietly with people who were afraid of being alone. The program launched with a small cohort of 8 participants, elderly people who needed temporary housing and support while they recovered from hospitalizations and prepared to return to independent living. Mrs. Garrett, an 83-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery, was our first resident. She had been living alone in a third-floor apartment with no elevator when she fell and broke her hip. After surgery, she couldn't manage the stairs, but she couldn't afford to move to a more accessible place. The hospital was ready to discharge her, but she had nowhere to go except a nursing home that would have bankrupted her within months. Our program gave Mrs. Garrett a ground-floor room in our transitional facility while she completed physical therapy and worked with a social worker to find permanent accessible housing. But more than that, it gave her a community of people who understood what she was going through. I watched Mrs. Garrett transform from a frightened, isolated woman into someone who laughed at dinner conversations and offered advice to newer residents who were struggling with their own transitions. She taught other residents how to play bridge and helped them navigate the complicated process of applying for housing assistance. When Mrs. Garrett moved into her new apartment 3 months later, she hugged me with tears in her eyes and said, "You gave me back my life. I thought I was done, but you showed me I still had choices." That was the moment I understood why Mother had trusted me with her inheritance. She had seen that I possessed something more valuable than business acumen or professional ambition: the ability to recognize human dignity in situations where others saw only problems to be managed. The program grew rapidly as word spread through the medical community about our success with difficult cases. We expanded to 20 beds within a year, and I hired additional staff members who shared my philosophy about treating elderly people with respect and individuality. But the real validation came when other counties began visiting our program to learn about our model. I found myself speaking at conferences and consulting with healthcare systems that wanted to replicate our approach to transitional care, standing in front of audiences of medical professionals and government officials, explaining how emotional support and community connection could improve health outcomes. I barely recognized myself as the woman who had once hidden in the corner at family gatherings. Mother's inheritance had given me more than money. It had given me the confidence to claim expertise I had earned through years of experience that society had never valued properly. Linda called me on a Tuesday evening 6 months after the program launched. I almost didn't answer, still uncertain about how to navigate our changed relationship, but curiosity won out. "I saw the article about your program in the newspaper," she said without preamble. "It sounds amazing." The article had been a feature story about innovative approaches to elder care, and the reporter had profiled our program as a model for other communities. She had interviewed several residents and their families, and their testimonials about the quality of care and attention they received had been powerful endorsements of our approach. "Thank you," I said, still unsure where this conversation was heading. "Rose, I need to tell you something." Linda's voice was different from any tone I remembered from our previous conversations, softer and more uncertain. "I've been volunteering at a senior center near my house just a few hours a week, helping with activities and meals." I waited for her to continue. "I started doing it because my therapist suggested I needed to find ways to connect with people outside of work. But spending time with these elderly people has made me realize how much I never understood about what you were doing with Mother." Linda paused, and I could hear her struggling with words that didn't come easily to her. "These people at the senior center, they don't care about my job or my house or any of the things I thought made me important. They care about whether I remember their names, whether I notice when they're having a bad day, whether I'm genuinely interested in their stories. It's the same thing you did with Mother, and I finally understand why she valued it so much." I felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Validation that my choices had worth, sadness that it had taken Linda so long to understand, and hope that maybe we could find some common ground after all. "It's never too late to learn to see people differently," I said. "I know that now. And Rose, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you're doing with the program. Mother would be so excited to see you using your gifts on such a large scale." After we hung up, I sat in Mother's kitchen, thinking about the strange turns my life had taken since her death. The inheritance that had seemed like the end of one story had actually been the beginning of another, more complex narrative about family, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways that people can change when their assumptions about the world are challenged. Marcus reached out to me a few weeks later, not with a phone call, but with a formal letter delivered by courier. The envelope was thick and expensive, and I expected it to contain legal documents or business proposals. Instead, it contained a handwritten letter and a check for $50,000. "Rose," the letter began, "I've been watching your work with the Transitional Care Program, and I'm amazed by what you've accomplished. You've created something that makes a real difference in people's lives, and you've done it with the grace and integrity that Mother always saw in you. I want to contribute to your program, not as charity, but as an investment in the kind of work that matters. I know that government funding is always uncertain, and I want to help ensure that you can continue serving people who need what you offer. I also want to apologize again for the way I treated you over the years. I measured worth by all the wrong standards, and I missed the opportunity to really know my own sister. I hope it's not too late for us to find a better way to be family. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect you to forget the hurtful things I said and did. But I hope you'll accept this contribution as a gesture of respect for the person you've always been and the leader you've become. With admiration and love, Marcus." I stared at the check for a long time, remembering all the years when $50,000 would have solved every financial problem I had ever faced. Now it represented something different. Recognition from someone whose opinion had once devastated me. Acknowledgement that the path I had chosen had value that transcended conventional measures of success. But more than that, it represented the possibility that people really could change. That the family dynamics I had grown up with weren't permanently fixed. That relationships could evolve when people were willing to examine their own assumptions and prejudices. I deposited Marcus's check into the program's development fund and sent him a brief note of thanks. I didn't promise renewed family relationships or immediate forgiveness, but I acknowledged his growth and his generosity. The truth was that I no longer needed their approval to feel valuable, but I appreciated their recognition of what I had built with Mother's gift. Their changed attitudes toward me reflected their own journey toward better understanding of what actually mattered in life. A year and a half after Mother's death, I stood in the garden she had loved, surrounded by flowers she had planted and vegetables I had learned to grow. The Transitional Care Program was thriving, serving more people than we had ever imagined possible. I had completed my nursing degree and was considering pursuing a master's in gerontology. But more importantly, I had built a life that felt authentic and meaningful, surrounded by people who valued the same things I valued. The residents of our program had become like family to me, and their families often told me that their loved ones spoke about our facility as the place that had given them hope when they thought their options had run out. Mrs. Henderson, now 86 and still sharp as ever, had become my closest friend and an unofficial advisor to the program. She often said that Mother would be bursting with pride if she could see what I had accomplished. "She always knew you had it in you," Mrs. Henderson told me during one of our weekly dinners. "She just wanted to make sure you had the chance to prove it to yourself." I thought about Mother's final words to me, her insistence that I promise not to let Linda and Marcus make me feel worthless. She had seen something in me that I couldn't see in myself at the time. The strength to defend my own worth, the wisdom to use unexpected gifts responsibly, and the courage to build something meaningful from the ashes of old family dynamics. The inheritance had been more than money or property. It had been permission to value myself the way she had valued me, to see my choices as valid rather than failures, to understand that success could be measured by love, given and received rather than wealth accumulated or status achieved. Standing in her garden that evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, I finally understood the full scope of Mother's final gift. She hadn't just given me financial security, she had given me the tools to transform myself from the woman who hid in the back corner of her own mother's funeral into someone who could stand confidently in front of county commissioners and medical professionals advocating for people who had no other voice. The shy, uncertain daughter who had doubted her own worth was gone forever. In her place was a woman who knew her value, who could set boundaries with family members who didn't respect her, who had the confidence to build something meaningful from the ground up. But perhaps most importantly, Mother had shown me that it was possible to choose love over approval, relationship over recognition, service over status, and still live a life of dignity and respect. She had proved that unconventional definitions of success could be valid and valuable, even in a world that often overlooked or dismissed them. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Dr. Williams, calling to tell me that the State Health Department wanted to feature our program in a statewide initiative to improve transitional care for elderly populations. "Rose, you've created something special here," she said. "This could be the model for similar programs across the entire state." I listened to her excitement about expansion possibilities and funding opportunities, feeling a mixture of pride and nervousness about the increased visibility and responsibility that such recognition would bring. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful for Mother's unexpected gift, for the family members who had learned to see me differently, for the elderly people who had trusted me with their care, and for the community that had embraced our unconventional approach to healing and dignity. When I hung up the phone, I walked back into the house that was now truly mine, past the photos of Mother and the bookshelf that had held her favorite novels, to the desk where I kept her final letter to me. I read it again, as I had dozens of times over the past year and a half, but this time the words felt different. Less like comfort for a grieving daughter, and more like prophecy fulfilled. A mother's confident prediction about the woman her child would become when given the freedom to choose her own path. "Use this gift wisely," Mother had written. "Not just the money, but the freedom it represents." I had used it wisely. I had built something lasting and meaningful, something that honored the values she had recognized in me from the beginning. I had proven that her faith in my potential had been justified, that her decision to trust me with her legacy had been the right choice. The woman who had been mocked at her mother's funeral had become someone who would be missed and mourned by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. The daughter who had been dismissed as a failure had created a success that couldn't be measured in dollars or status, but could be seen in the faces of elderly people who had been given dignity and hope when they thought both were lost forever. Mother's final gift hadn't just changed my life. It had given me the tools to change other people's lives, to create ripples of compassion and respect that would continue long after I was gone. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to the bedroom that had once been hers and was now mine, I whispered a thank you into the quiet house. "Thank you for seeing my worth when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for giving me the chance to prove that love and presence have value that transcends conventional success. Thank you for teaching me that the best inheritance isn't money or property, but the confidence to live according to your own values regardless of what other people think." The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities to serve people who needed what I had learned to give. Every day was a chance to honor Mother's memory by choosing compassion over judgment, relationship over recognition, service over self-interest. The girl who had hidden in the corner had become a woman who stood proudly in the light, not because she had inherited wealth, but because she had inherited the courage to be exactly who she was meant to be. 3 years after Mother's death, I received a phone call that would test everything I had learned about strength, family, and forgiveness. The caller was a nurse from Mercy General Hospital, and her voice carried the careful professionalism that healthcare workers use when delivering difficult news. "Ms. Patterson, I'm calling about your brother Marcus. He's been admitted to our ICU following a severe heart attack, and he's listed you as his emergency contact." I stared at the phone, struggling to process this information. Marcus, who was only 45 years old and had always seemed invincible in his expensive suits and commanding presence, was now lying unconscious in a hospital bed. The brother who had questioned my competence to manage our mother's inheritance was now depending on me to make decisions about his care. Is he going to be okay? I asked, though I knew the nurse couldn't give me the reassurance I was seeking. He's stable for now, but his condition is serious. The doctors would like to speak with you about his treatment options and prognosis. Can you come in? I was at the hospital within an hour, walking through the same corridors where I had once worked as a home health aide, past the rooms where I had cared for patients whose families couldn't or wouldn't provide the support they needed. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus, who had spent years dismissing the value of caregiving, now needed the kind of care I had been providing for others my entire adult life. Dr. Rodriguez, the cardiologist overseeing Marcus's treatment, met me in the family conference room. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the exhausted demeanor of someone who worked too many hours dealing with too much human suffering. Your brother suffered what we call a widowmaker heart attack, she explained, using medical terminology that I understood from my nursing studies. A complete blockage of the left anterior descending artery. We were able to open the artery and restore blood flow, but there was significant damage to the heart muscle. She showed me charts and test results that painted a picture of a man whose body had been pushed beyond its limits by stress, poor diet, and the kind of high-pressure lifestyle that prioritizes achievement over health. Marcus had been working 16-hour days at his law firm, surviving on coffee and takeout food, ignoring symptoms that should have sent him to a doctor months earlier. What's his prognosis? I asked. If he survives the next 72 hours, his chances improve significantly. But he's going to need extensive cardiac rehabilitation, major lifestyle changes, and probably several months of recovery before he can consider returning to any kind of work. Dr. Rodriguez paused, studying my face carefully. Ms. Patterson, I need to ask about your brother's support system. Does he have family who can help with his recovery? A spouse, children, close friends? I thought about Marcus's life as I knew it. He had been married briefly in his 30s, but the marriage had ended in an acrimonious divorce that he blamed on his ex-wife's inability to understand the demands of his career. He had no children, and his social life seemed to revolve entirely around work colleagues and professional networking events. He's divorced, I said. No children. I'm not sure about close friends outside of work. Recovery from a major cardiac event requires more than medical treatment, Dr. Rodriguez said gently. Patients need emotional support, help with daily activities, and someone to ensure they're following their rehabilitation program. Without that support, the risk of depression, medication non-compliance, and repeat cardiac events increases dramatically. I understood what she was really asking. Marcus needed a caregiver, someone to do for him what I had done for our mother during her final illness. The brother who had questioned my ability to manage financial responsibilities now needed the kind of personal care that couldn't be delegated to professionals or managed through efficient systems. I'll take care of him, I heard myself saying, though I hadn't consciously made that decision. Dr. Rodriguez looked relieved. That's wonderful. We'll arrange for discharge planning and make sure you have all the resources you need for his home recovery. I called Linda from the hospital parking lot, knowing that she needed to hear about Marcus's condition from family rather than discovering it through some other channel. She answered on the first ring, her voice immediately tense when she saw my name on her caller ID. Rose, is everything okay? I told her about Marcus's heart attack, his current condition, and the long recovery process ahead of him. Linda was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her processing the information. I'll catch the next flight, she said finally. He shouldn't be alone. But when Linda arrived at the hospital the next day, it became clear that her presence was more about managing her own anxiety than providing meaningful support for Marcus. She paced the ICU waiting room, making phone calls to his law partners and trying to arrange for coverage of his cases as if the most important concern was minimizing the professional disruption of his illness. When Marcus finally regained consciousness 48 hours after his heart attack, Linda's first words to him were about work. Don't worry about the Morrison case, she said, leaning over his hospital bed. I spoke with Jennifer, and she's going to handle everything until you're back on your feet. Marcus looked confused and disoriented, struggling to focus on her words. I could see the monitors tracking his heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels, all of which showed signs of stress as Linda continued her rapid-fire update about professional obligations he couldn't process in his current state. Linda, I said quietly, maybe we should let him rest. She looked at me with irritation, as if I was interfering with important business. He needs to know that his practice is being handled properly. He's worked too hard to build his reputation to let it fall apart now. I realized that Linda genuinely didn't understand what Marcus needed in that moment. She was trying to help by addressing what she assumed were his primary concerns, but she couldn't see past the professional identity to the vulnerable human being who was scared and confused and facing his own mortality for the first time. Over the next few days, as Marcus slowly stabilized and began the process of understanding what his recovery would require, Linda struggled with the reality of caregiving in ways that reminded me of our interactions during Mother's illness. She was uncomfortable with the physical aspects of his care, impatient with his emotional needs, and constantly looking for ways to delegate responsibility to medical professionals. Surely there are services that can handle most of this, she said during a family meeting with the discharge planning team. Private nurses, rehabilitation facilities, meal delivery services. Marcus can afford the best care available. The social worker, a patient woman named Carol who had seen thousands of families navigate medical crises, explained gently that recovery from major cardiac events required more than professional services could provide. Research shows that patients with strong family support systems have significantly better outcomes, Carol said. It's not just about managing medications and attending appointments. It's about having someone who notices changes in mood or energy, who can provide encouragement during difficult moments, who can help maintain motivation for lifestyle changes that are essential for long-term health. Linda looked increasingly uncomfortable as Carol described the kind of hands-on, emotional support that Marcus would need. I could see her mentally calculating the impact on her own life and career, weighing her family obligations against her professional ambitions. Rose has more experience with this kind of care, Linda said finally, looking at me with an expression that mixed relief and guilt. She's better suited for caregiving than I am. I felt a familiar surge of resentment at being automatically assigned the role of family caregiver while Linda preserved her freedom to maintain her own priorities. But this time, the resentment was tempered by understanding of something I hadn't recognized during Mother's illness. Linda's discomfort with caregiving wasn't just selfishness or lack of compassion. It was genuine inability to provide the kind of emotional presence that sick people need. Some people are naturally gifted at sitting quietly with suffering, at reading the subtle signs of physical and emotional distress, at providing comfort without trying to fix or solve or manage. Other people are more comfortable with action and efficiency and concrete problem solving. Neither approach is inherently better or worse, but caregiving requires skills that Linda had never developed and seemed unable to learn. I'll take care of Marcus, I said, not because I felt obligated, but because I recognized that I was the only one in our family who could provide what he needed. Marcus was discharged to my house 2 weeks after his heart attack. The spare bedroom, that I had prepared for transitional care program participants, became his recovery room, equipped with the medical equipment and monitoring devices that would help track his progress. The first few days were challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus, who had spent his entire adult life controlling every aspect of his environment, struggled with the helplessness and dependence that serious illness imposes. He was frustrated by his physical weakness, embarrassed by his need for assistance with basic activities, and frightened by the unpredictability of his recovery process. But perhaps most difficult for him was the forced inactivity. Marcus had defined himself through constant motion and achievement, and the requirement to rest and recover felt like a form of imprisonment. He tried to work from bed, taking phone calls and reviewing documents until his cardiologist explicitly forbade any professional activities for at least 6 weeks. "This is ridiculous," he said one afternoon, watching me prepare his lunch according to the strict cardiac diet requirements. "I feel fine. I could be back in the office next week if everyone would stop treating me like an invalid." I looked at him lying in the hospital bed we had rented for his recovery, connected to a heart monitor that showed irregular rhythms whenever he became agitated, and I saw the same denial that many patients experience when serious illness forces them to confront their own vulnerability. "Marcus, you had a massive heart attack 2 weeks ago," I said gently. "Your heart needs time to heal, and your body needs time to adjust to the medications. Pushing too hard too fast could cause another cardiac event." He stared at the ceiling, his hands clenched into fists of frustration. "I've worked for 20 years to build my practice. If I'm away too long, clients will go to other firms. Partners will question my reliability. Everything I've worked for could disappear." I sat down in the chair beside his bed, recognizing the fear behind his anger. Marcus had built his entire identity around professional success, and the threat of losing that success felt like a threat to his fundamental sense of self. "Your life is more important than your career," I said, though I knew the words would sound meaningless to someone who had never learned to separate his worth from his achievements. "Easy for you to say," Marcus replied, his voice bitter with old resentments. "You never had a career to lose." The comment stung, but I realized it also revealed something important about Marcus's worldview. He genuinely couldn't imagine finding meaning or purpose outside of professional achievement. The idea of measuring worth by relationships, service, or personal growth was foreign to him, in the same way that my approach to caregiving had once seemed incomprehensible to Linda. Over the following weeks, as Marcus slowly began to accept the reality of his recovery timeline, I watched him struggle with questions he had never been forced to consider. Without work to structure his days and define his purpose, he seemed lost and uncertain about how to spend his time or what to think about. I tried to engage him in activities that might provide meaning beyond professional accomplishment. I brought him books about philosophy and spirituality, suggested meditation or gentle exercise, encouraged him to consider hobbies or interests he had abandoned in pursuit of career success. But Marcus resisted most of these suggestions, dismissing them as frivolous distractions from the serious business of life. He couldn't understand why I found satisfaction in gardening or reading or volunteering, activities that produced no measurable achievement or financial reward. The breakthrough came during his 4th week of recovery, when Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who was staying in our transitional care program, had a minor medical emergency that required hospitalization. Her family lived in another state, and she was frightened and confused about navigating the healthcare system alone. I asked Marcus if he would be willing to help Mrs. Chen understand her legal rights as a patient and to review the consent forms she was being asked to sign. It was a simple request that would give him something useful to do while remaining within his doctor's restrictions on activity. Marcus agreed, perhaps more out of boredom than altruism, but something unexpected happened during his conversation with Mrs. Chen. For the first time since his heart attack, I saw him focus completely on someone else's needs rather than his own fears and frustrations. Mrs. Chen spoke limited English and had been signing medical forms without understanding their contents because she was afraid of appearing difficult or ungrateful. Marcus spent 2 hours patiently explaining each document, researching her rights as a non-English-speaking patient, and helping her advocate for interpreter services that the hospital was legally required to provide. When Mrs. Chen returned from the hospital the next day, she brought Marcus a small gift, a hand-painted card with Chinese characters that she explained meant, "Friend who helps in time of need." I watched Marcus study the card with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like wonder. "She made this for me," he said, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone would create something beautiful just to express gratitude. "She wanted to thank you for treating her with respect and dignity," I said. "That meant more to her than you probably realize." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, turning the card over in his hands. "I've been practicing law for 20 years, and I don't think anyone has ever thanked me like this." I realized that Marcus had spent his entire career treating legal work as a business transaction rather than a form of service to people who needed help. He had measured success by billable hours and case outcomes rather than by the human impact of his work. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began asking about the other residents in our transitional care program. He offered to help with legal questions and paperwork, always careful to stay within his physical limitations, but clearly energized by the opportunity to use his skills in service of people who genuinely needed help. I watched him transform from an impatient, frustrated patient into someone who looked forward to the small ways he could contribute to our community of healing. He helped Mr. Williams understand his Medicare benefits, assisted Ms. Rodriguez with reviewing her apartment lease, and provided legal advice to families navigating complex medical and financial decisions. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus began to understand why I had found meaning in caregiving work that society didn't value highly. He saw that helping vulnerable people navigate difficult situations required more than technical expertise. It required empathy, patience, and the ability to see each person as a complete human being with dignity and worth, regardless of their circumstances. "I think I've been practicing law wrong for my entire career," Marcus told me one evening as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset. "I treated clients like problems to be solved rather than people who needed help." I looked at my brother, still pale and thin from his heart attack, but somehow more present and engaged than I had ever seen him. "What would you do differently now?" Marcus was quiet for several minutes, considering the question seriously. "I think I'd want to work with people who really need legal help but can't afford high-end representation. Elderly people facing scams or abuse, families dealing with medical debt, people who get lost in systems they don't understand." I felt a surge of hope that Marcus was discovering what Mother had seen in me years earlier, that the most meaningful work involves serving people who have been overlooked or dismissed by society's more prestigious institutions. 6 months after his heart attack, Marcus was medically cleared to return to work, but he chose not to resume his previous practice. Instead, he joined a legal aid clinic that served elderly and low-income clients, taking a significant pay cut, but finding a level of personal satisfaction he had never experienced in his high-powered career. Linda struggled to understand Marcus's career change in much the same way she had struggled to understand Mother's inheritance decision. She visited during his recovery and expressed concern about his dramatic life changes and his decision to throw away everything he had worked to achieve. "You're having some kind of midlife crisis," she told him during one particularly tense conversation. "This isn't who you really are. You're a successful attorney, not a social worker." But Marcus had found something in his work with vulnerable clients that his previous career had never provided, a sense of purpose that transcended personal achievement. He was using his skills to help people who genuinely needed what he could offer, and their gratitude reminded him daily that his work had meaning beyond billable hours and partnership tracks. A year after Marcus's heart attack, the three of us gathered for dinner at my house to mark the anniversary of Mother's death. It was the first time we had all been in the same room since the hostile aftermath of the will reading, and I wasn't sure what to expect from the encounter. But the siblings who sat around my dinner table were different people from the ones who had fought so bitterly over inheritance and family hierarchy. Marcus looked healthier and more relaxed than I had ever seen him, his face animated as he told stories about his legal aid clients and the satisfying challenges of helping people navigate complex systems. Linda seemed quieter and more thoughtful, less focused on projecting success and more interested in genuine conversation. She had been volunteering at a senior center for months now, and the experience was changing her perspective on what constituted a meaningful life. "I've been thinking about Mother's letter to me," Linda said as we sat on the back porch after dinner, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. She wrote that she hoped I would eventually understand that achievement without compassion is hollow. Linda turned to look at me, her expression serious and somewhat vulnerable. I think I'm finally beginning to understand what she meant. All my professional success feels empty compared to the connections I've made with people at the senior center. Marcus nodded in agreement. My heart attack forced me to examine what really mattered to me. But I think Mother's inheritance decision was what started all of us questioning our assumptions about worth and success. I thought about the 4 years that had passed since Mother's death, about the battles we had fought and the growth we had all experienced. She knew what she was doing when she structured her will the way she did. She wasn't just distributing assets. She was challenging all of us to become better people. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, 3 siblings who had finally learned to see each other clearly, instead of through the lens of old resentments and competitive dynamics. "Rose," Marcus said finally, "I want to thank you for taking care of me during my recovery. You could have refused, given how badly I treated you over the years. But you chose to help anyway, and that meant more to me than you probably realize." Linda reached over and took my hand, a gesture of affection that felt genuine rather than obligatory. "Mother was right about you. You always were the strongest of us and the wisest. We just couldn't see it because we were measuring strength and wisdom by all the wrong standards." I felt tears forming in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of finally being seen and understood by the family members whose opinions had shaped my self-image for so many years. "We all had to grow into the people Mother hoped we could become," I said. "She gave each of us what we needed, even if we couldn't see it at the time." As my siblings prepared to leave that evening, I realized that Mother's most important gift hadn't been the inheritance that had changed my life. It had been the catalyst for transformation that had allowed all 3 of her children to discover their capacity for growth, compassion, and authentic connection with others. The family that had been broken by competition and misunderstanding had been healed by the recognition that love and service and genuine human connection were more valuable than any amount of money or professional achievement. Standing in the doorway, watching Marcus and Linda drive away into the night, I felt Mother's presence more strongly than I had since her death. She had orchestrated this healing from beyond the grave, using her final act as a parent to teach her children lessons they couldn't have learned any other way. The woman who had been mocked at her mother's funeral had become someone whose worth was recognized not just by her siblings, but by the hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her work. The daughter who had been dismissed as a failure had proven that success could be measured by love given and received, by service provided to those who needed it most, by the courage to live according to values that transcended conventional definitions of achievement. Mother's inheritance had been more than money or property. It had been an invitation to become the people we were meant to be, freed from the constraints of other people's expectations and empowered to choose our own definitions of a life well lived. That night, I sat in the garden Mother had loved, surrounded by the roses she had planted and the vegetables I had learned to grow. The transitional care program was thriving, serving more people than we had ever imagined possible. Marcus was finding fulfillment in work that honored his skills while serving those in need. Linda was discovering that connection and compassion could provide satisfaction that professional achievement had never delivered. Most importantly, we had learned to value each other for who we truly were, rather than for what we had accomplished or accumulated. The siblings who had once competed for approval and recognition had found something more valuable: genuine love and respect based on character rather than achievement. Mother's final lesson had taken years to unfold, but its truth was undeniable. The daughter she had chosen to inherit everything had used that gift not just to transform her own life, but to create ripples of healing and understanding that touched everyone around her. The girl who had hidden in the corner was gone forever, replaced by a woman who stood confidently in the light, surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was. And in that transformation, Mother's deepest wish had been fulfilled. Her children had finally learned to see worth in all its forms, not just the ones that society rewarded with money and status. The inheritance was complete, but the legacy would continue for generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.